Welcome everybody to the Giga Rambles. I'm John.
Hey guys, we're here on a Friday.
I will record that song for the rest of eternity.
Yeah, be careful now. For those of you that don't realize, anything on the internet lasts forever.
Especially when I have it recorded.
Exactly.
So today we're talking about, is there a paradigm shift in miniatures game design? So there's a lot of new games coming out, as always. There are new games coming out every year. And then we've noticed some interesting shifts that have happened. I guess you could say meta shifts that have been happening. So John, you want to start us off?
Yeah, so like we've kind of touched on this on other rambles and things like that before, but like we'll jump more into an in-depth dive about how newer games coming out are focusing on being smaller in scale and really focusing on character, like heavy on character, smaller in scale, and with a more approachable rule set. And there's a couple of key features that we see popping up in game after game after game. And it is one of those things, is it, you know, more or less convergent evolution? Is this just a conclusion that all these companies are reaching together, or are they seeing what works and then
looking at the success of others and putting their own hat in the ring?
Exactly. And so there's a lot of different viewpoints you can take on this, and I'm more on the convergent evolution thought on things, just because I know how long it takes for a game to really develop.
Oh yeah.
And yeah, there might be some like, oh, we know they're coming out with this thing, so let's try to do something similar. But let's get more into detail about what we've seen.
Yeah, what does that mean, emergent evolution, when you say that?
Convergent evolution. Oh, basically, those that aren't paleontology nerds. Mark, you want to give the...
Well, I was going to give an example of, like, you have the same product invented in multiple areas. Like, even in a mechanical standpoint, like, the wheel probably had its origins in multiple places. Even though humanity was so spread out, it's not like the wheel spread out from one location.
Correct. It was the most efficient solution for a problem.
Yeah.
And so in biology, it usually describes creatures from different ecosystems having the same adaptations with no really close genetic link to them. Yeah. And so
like
for
popping out of the water at the same time.
For game systems, it's we're seeing a lot of similar mechanics, and we're not saying that they're like carbon copies, but they are close enough to where you're like, okay, cool, these guys came to the same thought about how to make these new games. And what we're seeing is grid-based games, so games with a set board to move on, a smaller, more well-defined rule set, and
4 pages.
No, I mean, like
that is a huge evolution.
And so to me, that was a precursor that maybe didn't survive in that way. It had to quickly adapt into a different way. But yeah, so grid, smaller based, smaller amount of models. Like, you're really seeing a lot of games pop out where you're going to need less than 20 models. And that could be for the entire game, like, you know, like on both sides.
Because what they're really trying to say is you don't have to lug in a cart full of models. You can just have that box.
Correct.
And even like Shadespire sells the box you could use to do it all with.
And so Mark starts bringing up specific examples. So we're seeing a lot of similar elements through games like Warhammer Underworlds, Corvus Belli's Aristea. Dust 1947 was kind of one of the first ones to do this.
Yep.
Then we're also seeing things like Monster Apocalypse, and then also the Riot Quest game that's coming out. And then other games with similar mechanics. I'm blanking out. The Other Side is coming out with the Inspire mechanic. And then there's a bunch of other like smaller games like I'm blanking out. The Warlord game, the one in the flying one.
Blood Red Skies?
Thank you. Blood Red Skies. Blood Red Skies and all these other like smaller skirmish games. Battlestar Galactica, X-Wing. These are all games where the board is almost set for you. So it cuts down on the actual table size you need, which I think a lot of these companies were like, we need to have games that people can play in their house to encourage them to try to introduce their family into it.
Another thing they're doing with all these games is they're making them cross-platform.
Correct.
They're making sure that you can use it for more than just this game. So
yeah.
if you are a fan of the larger scale game, you can take the models and use it in both. So it can be your introduction to the skirmish or vice versa.
Correct. And so once again, we'll use Dust 1947 as an example. When you buy the game, you're provided with a grid to play on, right? Mm-hmm. The points are very small, but once you get into the game, you can do the like open field mode, where you're no longer on a grid. You know, like the terrain is more elaborate. You get to move around and shoot guys and things like that. But it is something to where you never have to go to that route if you don't want to. You can always play the grid-based, smaller set board game-esque kind of thing.
And I'm a fan of that.
Yeah, and it's a really strong design standpoint, giving you modularity. So basically, it is all of these design choices seem to be trying to hit a larger target. You know, it is no longer game designers making games for themselves, in a sense. It is game designers making games for an audience. And it's as wide of an audience as they can really get. And so it's a big shift, and companies themselves seem to now understand that they need to reach younger people. They need to reach a wider audience. It's no longer just going to be your 20 to 30 something dude out of college who's got money to blow, getting into Warhammer, dumping a couple grand on an army. Yeah. It's that generation's getting older and still interested in playing. They're interested in bringing their family in.
Exactly.
And now with the rise of cell phones and video games and online everything, right? You lose track of social interaction, right? Like face-to-face. And so they're trying to target that, right? So people need a social outlet. And they're so used to games, they're so used to being on their phone that these games provide a structured social interaction that they can meet new people, make friends, play a game, and build a hobby, right? Build something that they can take with us.
Yeah.
So
I definitely think a key to having a scalable game, though, like where you can do the size, is to have balance maintained.
Yeah, absolutely.
Each point level. I remember in Warhammer Fantasy, that was definitely an issue.
Correct.
With slow grow leagues at 500 points as an Empire player, which is very weird. I could be like, I'm going to crush everybody.
Yeah.
It's like, but I'm sending regular humans at them. It's like, yeah. For some reason at this point, but it's because humans basically filled that niche of like, we can be the jack of all trades.
Yeah.
While all the elite armies were just like, I can bring 10 models. Like, I brought 50.
Yeah.
And they're decent.
Well, think about all the Lord of the Rings movies. This is a small group of humans just taking down everything.
Yeah.
It's actually it's the inverse property, right?
Oh, yeah. It's like ninjas, right?
Yeah. The less amount of people you have, the better they're going to do.
Yeah.
However, if you have like a whole army, they're just going to get wrecked by Sauron, right?
Yeah.
You know, so it's that. But yeah, David Woolbright's talking about games are absolutely being built to be scalable now. We see that with Kill Team. Once again, that's a smaller board that you can bring home. They provide the board with you in the box for the most part. And you can slowly build that up to a full 40k army if you want, but if not, you can just leave it at the Kill Team. Necromunda is like an extreme example of that. And that's more so for like the role-playing and like that sort of aspect to it, right? You know, you're not going to build a Necromunda army, Mark, into a full-fledged army.
Or am I?
Yeah, Mark is.
Yeah.
But that is something that can lead to another game. And I think that's another one of those like shifts where Mark talked about it a little bit earlier, but these games are meant to, you know, take you from one point and move you to another, right? So like Riot Quest from Privateer Press is coming out probably this fall. We don't have a confirmed date yet, but it is a small scale game set in the War Machine setting.
In an alternate post-apocalyptic future.
Correct. But let's just do War Machine setting.
Yeah.
It's based on a grid, all that sort of stuff, but every model that you get for Riot Quest can be used in the larger War Machine and Hordes game. So, once again, you get to play this like small, cool skirmish game with these really awesome, characterful figures, but then you get into it, you want to explore that world more, we can take those figures and start building an army with them. So
yeah, that's interesting. Like seeing that these larger games that inherently, like you're saying, have these larger amounts. Now, for some games, in terms of scalability, some of them start off really small, and then where do they go from there? So like Legion has a little bit of that problem. They started off with just a very core set, but they've expanded over the several months. So someone getting into Legion, Star Wars Legion now, has an easier time of building something that's a little more varied compared to people who got it right off the bat.
And so we're talking about common solutions. A common problem that we're seeing right now is, especially with the Kickstarter age and the fact that these games are all coming to the same more or less conclusion, it is a lot of them are playing the who's first game, right? So in some games, they don't come out with enough variability, and that can hurt them. We saw it with Legion. Monster Apocalypse saw a similar issue where there wasn't enough variety, right? So, like, there's only so many times that you can play against the same army time and time again.
Yeah, you have the good, you have the bad, but third person wants to play the ugly.
Yeah. Or even the other person wants to play the not quite as good, or maybe the not quite as bad.
The questionably bad, questionably good.
Yeah, but so one of the solutions they're finding is have a lot of characterful models, right? Like, there's been a big focus on smaller factions, especially in those big war games, right? The big war games used to be, maybe 8 factions at most, right? But Games Workshop, Privateer Press, Corvus Belli, Malifaux, all that sort of stuff, they keep adding in more factions because they found out that their players like to specialize. They like to find that one little niche that they enjoy and build an army from there. And so when Legion came out, it is the classic good versus bad, your episode 4 guys, right? And that becomes an issue when me and Mark are both playing Rebels. Our lists are identical. We're playing the mirror match. What's really... it becomes really tedious after a while is playing the mirror match.
Right.
I don't like playing the mirror match in any tournament I go to.
You don't really learn what you're weak against.
Yeah. It's usually a game of cat and mouse, right? It's the guy, or the guy who makes the first mistake, or who commits too early or commits too late.
Yeah,
it becomes very much that sort of thing, and so I love seeing all these new games come out with this like huge variety of factions or model types and things like that, and it's really exciting. But I think it hurts a lot of games when they show up and they're like, all right, you can play either Team A or Team B.
See, that's when we went to Reno last year.
Yeah.
The Parabellum.
Yeah.
It's like, that looks really good.
2 factions.
2 factions.
Yeah. And so you can have the most amazing miniatures in the world, but 2 factions or a limited amount of factions, not giving people the diversity that they want, can really hamstring a game. Other examples, we saw that when Necromunda first came out. People were only buying Goliath and Escher, and the community was like, oh, hey, we're really glad to see Necromunda, but we're not really going to start getting super heavy into it until we see other factions or models come out.
But now we have that.
Yeah, and Necromunda's huge. And luckily, Games Workshop is a big enough company that they can make it work, right? Like, they can say, like, all right, cool, Necromunda's out. Don't worry, guys. We know 6 months from now you'll all be playing because we're still going to continue to support and push it.
Yeah.
Smaller game companies, if they don't hit that success within the first couple months, the game's dead, right? Like, they have to move on to the next thing. They have to try to find it. And I mean, sometimes they'll try to pour support in to fix it, but a lot of other times they're just going to be like, all right, cool.
Cut losses.
Yeah. I'm looking at you, Rune Wars. I mean, it's still going, I think.
No, yeah. Remember we talked to David in Fort Wayne?
Yeah.
And he was saying, like, he had a thriving Rune Wars community.
Yeah. So, I mean, it just depends. Sometimes these games can recover. Sometimes they can't. It just, it's one of those things where variety will get people into it. Me and Mark both have the aesthetics that we're going to go towards, right? Me, if it's got lizards or dinosaurs in it, I'm all set. Mark, you are the human.
Yeah.
Mark Mark likes nothing more than to see humans be humans doing human things.
Being just terrible people to each other and trying to make it work.
Yeah.
For the greater good, but not Taoish-wise.
Yeah, David Woolbright says Lord of the Rings is having the problem where players want all of the choices immediately, and it speaks to how hard it is for a company to have all the products available immediately.
Yeah.
In the defense, the movies came out ages ago.
Yeah, no, but that is so it is an issue, right? Like it is coming out with enough stuff to appease the player base.
Yeah.
But then you have to hit a rhythm, right? You have to hit a stride of, hey, we're introducing new things, we're introducing new models, doing whatever.
Yeah.
A lot of the bigger companies like Games Workshop has really struck a chord with, like, let's say 40K and Age of Sigmar. Lord of the Rings is one of like a reboot, right? More or less, like they're rebooting the game, the community, and all that sort of stuff. And I think they are still trying to hit that stride. They're still trying to make sure that they are releasing new content or keeping up with old content in a way that appeases.
As far as Lord of the Rings is concerned, I definitely think that if you just take everything, because they have all the IP there, they know what everything looks like. They had these beautiful movies that say this is what this is supposed to look like. They have even like all this extra art. Like I played the old Lord of the Rings card game, and it had art that you would never see in a movie, but they have all this extra art that they can base these models off of. And you're like, well, why don't we have it immediately?
Yeah.
And the answer is, if you just dump this on someone's lap, they're gonna be like, all right, I just want this. But if you like, all right, here's the starter stuff, and so I was like, cool, I know what the starter stuff does, and now I know that in a month I can wait for something new that's going to change the game. Like as long as if you throw something on someone's lap, the meta is set.
Yeah.
There's no longer going to be like any shifting, like, oh, this is good, this is good, this is good, no, now this is bad. But it's just, here it is. And but by slowly releasing models, you get to have this evolving game as you progress. So you're not stuck playing the same armies from day 1 to day 100.
And so let's talk about something that recently came up in the community. Speaking of evolving games, the fact that these games are now more fluid than ever.
Oh yeah.
And what that means is we live in an age where these companies can actively modify and change rules on the fly and provide you ways of access that were non-existent before, right?
Like the way I see that it used to do it, and this is just looking at War Machine Hordes, was they had a unit. The unit wasn't doing too hot in the meta. Yeah. And the way they tried to fix it is, like, all right, we're going to give you a unit attachment or a weapon attachment.
Yeah, and this would be a commander or like a bazooka or whatever that would change the rules to the unit or add rules.
It would give them some nice benefit. It would give them like a mini feat, something they can use once per game. But that's it. That's the only thing they could really do to change it, because they couldn't go back and say, all right, everyone, rip page 96 out of your book and staple this over it. Or something. So no, but now that we're, like John said, with the phones and everything, you can have that updated to everybody like that. Yeah. Like everyone's on the same page day 1.
And it's all major game systems. We can see that now. They're active with their rules and all that. And I personally love it because no longer
will we bow to the game companies. Terrible.
More importantly, no longer do you have to lament a bad purchase.
Yes, exactly.
Right. Because if you choose a game that has really good models, you can petition the company maybe for better rules or something. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, and so that's a very good point, John. You can. Most of these game companies, Games Workshop, Privateer Press, Corvus Belli, like everything that we've talked about before, they are responsive to feedback.
Yes, they put their ear to the ground. They're listening.
Yeah, and so you can say, hey, listen, constructively.
Yes, you do have to be constructive.
Yeah, it's like
they try their best to weed out whiners.
Correct, and you can say, hey, listen, I've tried to make this model or unit or this part of the game work. Here are my experiences. This is my thoughts on what I would like to see, and the developers will listen. They will 100% read that at a given point, and they will take that into the consideration to update and change the game.
Two things real quick. Tim Korkluski, who is actually the designer for Ragnarok, which is a new game that's coming out soon. Looks awesome, by the way. We want to have him on, so Tim, I'll reach out to you. Talking about his game there. But he's saying miniatures agnostic is becoming a thing, very much becoming a thing. And then for those, miniatures agnostic basically is you can bring whatever miniatures you want and you can play the system with those.
Yeah, there's a lot of pluses and minuses to that. I do want to get to Jarek's question.
Yeah.
Jarek asks, in our opinion, what's the minimum factions to make a game worth investing in? My arbitrary number that I've seen work time and time again is 4.
Yeah.
4 to start?
Like, with 4, I think that's a good start.
I think 4 is the minimum you want. Because if you have a group of 8 people playing, which I think is a healthy community to get started, that means theoretically, if all things are equal, each faction should be played twice, and there should be enough variety in the models to where you can play that faction in 2 different ways to start off with.
And
so, like, put 2 different leaders or 2 different types of units, like that sort of thing.
And you're not the only one playing your faction, so you will never not encounter your faction.
Correct. And so I think that's important. 4, I think, is a good number to start with. You might be able to get away with 3, but I think that's a little risky. Mm-hmm. The whole miniature agnostic thing, I'm always 50-50 on it.
Yeah, same.
Because I love seeing people's interpretations of their universes and their worlds. That kind of gets me in the game.
Yep. And it's kind of funny that you say you're 50-50 because that's really where I am with the Genestealer Cult Army I'm doing ish. So, like, for example, we talked about this last week where I rolled with it. Enough of you typed F to force me into this.
Thanks, everyone.
You did it.
But no, it's underway.
Yeah.
I've started the conversions. I ordered 4 12 heads and things like that.
I bought them a box.
Yeah, thank you so much, John. All right. But, no, like, it started. So, like, for example, here is, it's going to take a while for the camera to catch up, but it's a hybrid, but I chopped off the extra arm. I put an Orlok head on it. Here's a Clan Escher.
So are you saying it's a hybrid?
Yeah. So, yeah, but there we go. So I've been putting Necromunda heads on these characters and chopping off any iconography I can find.
Yeah.
And I'm slowly developing it. But, for example, I don't want any association with Genestealers. I don't want any association with a cult. But, like, for example, my Patriarch is going to be an Immortan Joe model with a Stump Croc from the Goliath gang. And that's going to be, he's going to be this big melee boss, and he's going to be in control of the Genestealers, which will be the Admech Sicaran Rust Stalkers.
Interesting.
But with the 2 blades, but with the dome heads. And they're going to be like refurbished robots that he's going to send out. Be his like elite entourage of cybernetic killers.
But on that same note, it is you taking models that exist in that world and repurposing them.
Yeah.
It's different than let's say Frostgrave, right?
Yeah.
Frostgrave has its own miniature line, but you can use any miniatures you like.
Mm-hmm.
And with me, there's pluses and minuses to that. But personally, because of the interest at the store, the models don't sell. The Frostgrave models don't sell. They're like, why would I buy the Frostgrave models when I have a perfectly good wizard right here?
Yeah, I played D&D a year ago. Here's my wizard.
Yeah. Or I have infantry from Warhammer, blah, blah, blah. And to me, that hurts the game in a little bit. So, like, I'd like to see their own stuff. And I actually love the Frostgrave miniatures, especially when they got to the Ghost Archipelago. Oh, my God. I mean, they have snake men in it, so I'm going to like it. But it's got the whole jungle vibe. It's got, like, new takes on these wizards and things like that. But for the life of us, like, we don't move them. We don't sell them. And what that means is that since we don't have the miniatures here, people can't look at the miniatures and get interested in the game.
Right.
And if they can't get interested in the game, that means the game doesn't get played here. And if the game doesn't get played here, more people won't see it being played and want to play it, right? Yeah. So, I personally love that I can use my Lizardmen as my war band, right?
Mm-hmm.
But since you give the option to everyone to just kind of use whatever, they will use whatever, and they'll maybe buy the book, or they'll wait for their friend to buy the book, and then just use the rules and all that. So,
and to that point, as a consumer, you want to have something that has character, because when you have a wizard, if it's like a different type of wizard for that game and has a lot of character to it, that makes me more willing to go for it. If it's just a generic wizard, it's like, all right.
Yeah, and so with Frostgrave, I see the wizards being really low fantasy.
Okay.
Low fantasy, like, you have this like kind of cool low fantasy thing, or maybe I think someone used a model from Saga, which is no fantasy. But it's much different to have that like Saga thing, and then a wizard like flying around on a disc with like fireballs like shooting out of his hands. Like there's a disparity between the looks, right? And so I find that miniature agnostics is helpful for people that maybe want to test the game out or want to dip their toes into it. But having miniatures to buy, and having miniatures to buy that maybe you can't find anywhere else, like, provide some creativity, right? Like, look what's out there. Look what people normally have. If you have a dragon in your game, dragons are a dime a dozen, right? So, but maybe have your dragon have a different take on it. Like, give them like
8 head.
Chinese dragon. Like, you don't really see Chinese dragons in games.
Yeah. And so,
like, invent a new type of.
Yeah, basically do something else. Take your own spin on it. Give your world something unique. Because once again, we are in an age of tabletop explosion, right? The industry is healthier than ever. There's so many games, so many things coming out. Making your mark is going to be hard enough as it is.
I mean, my mom didn't have any trouble.
Nice.
Sorry.
Tim says that he takes a directed miniatures agnostic approach, so I asked him to elaborate, because that sounds interesting for sure.
Yeah. So, yeah.
Okay, so he says in terms of like Ragnarok, which he's designing, he has an official miniatures line that he encourages use, but that's not necessary.
Yes, there should be a fair balance of like easing access into your game and wanting a desire to buy your model. So I think an issue with Frostgrave is I would look at the models and be like, I think I can go to the WizKids line and find a better model for it.
Yeah.
And that's the thing, like, because WizKids has the money to invest in all these designs.
Right.
Yeah.
So I think at that point you should have tried to really build up an interest in your line. Perhaps say like, all right, we're not going to make as many, but we're going to make them much better.
Right.
So that people want your line, and then you could slowly build that up from there. So like you say, use the models that we support, and if you want to venture out, feel free to get those others.
Yeah, absolutely.
Speaking on to how getting people into the game. Besides just the models, though, in terms of the design, what are some trends y'all are seeing in terms of getting new players into things?
Smaller rule sets.
Okay.
No longer, if I'm like, Mark, do you want to learn how to play Warhammer Fantasy? And Mark's like, yeah, sure, John.
Yeah.
This is a younger Mark.
Yeah.
And then drop a 200-page tome in front of him and be like, hey, read up on that.
Oh, gee golly, mister. This is real.
It is... the ease of access to the games is the way to entice new players, right? Having... Like, I don't want to have to take a night off to learn how to play a game that I bought into anymore, right? Like, people want to be able to crack open the box and get into it. Night Vault's a good example. Dust 1947. The other side is a fantastic example because everything's pre-assembled, right?
Yeah.
So, you can literally dump the box out and start playing within minutes.
And if you're really lucky, they'll land in their trays, too.
Yeah, exactly. And so, like, these games... the entry-level games, so Age of Sigmar is now considered an entry-level game for Games Workshop, or that's what they market it as.
Okay.
You still have to build and assemble your models, but the rules themselves, so like me and Mark could be like, hey, let's do something crazy and expensive. Let's start new armies over the weekend.
Yeah.
So we can together, assemble boxes, and then go from there. The rules are easy to grasp and get into, but then it is not just the core rules that you have to learn. It is the army rules, the realm rules, the endless spell rules. So the game expands on themselves.
Yeah.
And they start adding in future expansions, right? And that's what keeps it interesting. With 40K, the core rules are very simple, but every time they update an army or do an FAQ or do a beta test, it shakes up the map.
Yeah.
So simple rule set that is constantly evolving in one way or the other.
Yeah, that depth, that layering is, can totally see that.
Surprisingly, I think one of the simplest and like it has real no pizzazz or fanciness to it is just changing the point cost of things.
Oh yeah,
like for example, being able to take an extra unit of this, all of a sudden that unit that you considered worthless, you now have like twice as many models for it. It's like, wow, now that I have twice as many of these guys, they actually do work. Like that wall of wounds you can just throw in front of maybe more important models now last twice as long. So you realize that it went from getting swarmed and then them pressing past them into your defenseless lines. All of a sudden, you last an extra turn, or you manage to push them back. Now you have like the same unit that you thought was worthless is one of your most important table now, and all it took was a point.
Yeah, Jarek asks basic rules and also advanced rules for more demanding wargamers. Yeah,
and
that's where Dust goes. Right?
Yeah, like I will sing the praises of Dust probably till the end of time.
Yep.
And this is probably these types of comments that I do about Dust is always when Gregoire isn't here.
I know. Right?
So Gregoire's like, why don't you ever talk about Dust, Sean? And be like, I'm not even like just watch the older stuff. But they do a really great job of doing those like quick rules, right, to get in there, and nothing feels like it's missing, right? But then when you like open those advanced rules, you're like, oh my god, there's so much. There's so much that like I can do, and that's a really great feeling to someone who is they love their models, they put time and effort painting them, or they just build an identity with it, right? And being like, hey, you can take all these things that you love and play them in a new, exciting way. And this is where the other side of miniature agnostics comes from, right? This is the plus side. For a while, Lizardmen, the Games Workshop Lizardmen, were my magnum opus of minis, right? So, like, they completed the best possible thoughts that minis could be to me, combining Aztec Mayan culture with lizard people riding dinosaurs. Like, if someone was like, hey, John, design a mini game or design your own faction, I would literally just barf out lizard men, and they'd be like, you're just copying Games Workshop. And I'm like, well, they nailed it. But with me, like, when they blew up the old world, and I was super salty, I wanted to find a new way to play those models I love, those models I identified with so much. And so...
Do I really identify with the Lizardmen, John?
Yeah. Like, yeah, they speak to my inner core. I'm cold all the time. I like dinosaurs. And I can move my eyes in two separate directions. I'm not doing it on camera. Just trust me that I can.
Yeah.
Okay. I believe it.
John's looking.
But so it is. With me, I wanted to find a way, and Frostgrave was that like way for me. I was just like, oh, they don't care about what minis I use. Kings of War was also a great way to do it, and Kings of War is another one that I kind of want to talk about. A good example of being that kind of right type of miniature agnostic. So, Lizardmen, I got to play them in Kings of War. For some reason, Kings of War had an exact equivalent for every single Lizardman model I had to be usable in Kings of War. I don't know how that happened. Probably Convergent Evolution. But, so...
Same base size? Really?
Yeah, same base sizes. I didn't have to rebase anything. It was amazing. And so I got to play them in Kings of War, which I thought was phenomenal. Now, the cool thing about Kings of War is that even though they had equivalents to every single kind of model that I had, the Kings of War fluff they were not the Aztec Mayan lizard men. They were these elemental beasts called the salamanders, right? And so these guys are all fire-based. They live in lava. They have hard shells. They have flame, obsidian weapons. So as I got more into the fluff and the lore, I'm like, okay, well, that's kind of cool. Maybe I want to start buying those Kings of War models so my lizards start fitting more into this world.
Yeah.
And that eventually got me to buy a unit of salamanders. I got to like build them up and do all that cool stuff. And so it is really, really, really cool to have that almost the... They didn't have a hard rule requiring you to play the old or their lizardmen, right?
Yeah.
But they, with the rules and how they were changing and how the lore and the experience was building, it just made me want to buy their stuff.
Yeah.
Right.
And that's really important. So, I mean, good job on Kings of War. They did a good job with that. So.
Sigismund was asking about if there's a pendulum swing between they have circular bases and individual model movement, and then rank and flank style games. If that might have a pendulum back at some point.
It might, in all honesty. So it might be one of those things where it swings back and forth, and there is... And I don't think it's necessarily design or anything like that. But it's just going to be like fashion, right? You know, like fashion has a tendency to repeat, but in slightly different ways.
Yeah.
Right.
You know, and
so round bases that do rank and
no,
yeah?
in all seriousness, because there are now round like
the trays.
Dan Cotroop's Tectonic Craft Studios, he makes movement trays for Age of Sigmar armies
in 40K.
In 40K, yeah, absolutely.
Just moving an IG regiment across the table.
Yeah.
It's miserable.
Tedious, right?
It's miserable.
And then also the other side just kind of cut out the middleman and made their own trays for all their units.
Right.
And I don't think it's necessarily one way or another being stronger. It is just going to be a, like Siggy was saying, a pendulum shift, right? Like I think from time to time it'll just bounce back and forth. It has nothing to do with success versus one or the other, but it is going to be, once again, another way to make the same minis you're using or change up the hobby in an exciting way to keep you engaged.
And that
John,
actually segues perfectly to the next question, which Jarek asks, which is basically, in terms of things like custom dice or things like that, when we have those, we have all the stuff on the table, you know, do you want to have all of your custom things there? So, for instance, for Kill Team, you have all the tokens, you have all these other little things you have to put on the table for the Kill Team. It's a smaller board, but I still end up having to buy an entire container just to keep all that custom stuff, versus like 40K, I just have the bunch of D6s and a measuring tape.
I enjoy widgets. I really enjoy widgets because they give you that, I guess, accuracy in your measurements every time. So when you say, I can move this widget plus my base size forward, I really love that about X-Wing. I think that's one of the best things because an issue I see a lot of times with any base where you move an individual, any game where you move an individual model is someone moves and you're like, is that really how far you could move? Because it's even with just how you see it and how your opponent sees it. They'll move the model forward, and from your angle, you see that they're like halfway past the tip of their tape measure. But from their angle, and so it does generate some confusion. But if you have the template, put your finger on the template so it doesn't move, pick up your model, you shift it to the other end of the like your opponent really can't complain about that unless they see you like dancing your finger along with the template.
Right. And so that can work really well for like if you're playing a lot of one game or if the game has a similar like movement levels and stuff. But the more and more we get into different types of games, they have all these different mechanics on them.
I'm the opposite of Mark. I hate custom stuff, widgets, all that sort of stuff. However, I probably own more widgets and custom stuff than anyone else here.
No, why do you hate it, John?
Because I like the idea of if I forget my trunk of widgets, I can just grab some dice and a tape measure and get to playing.
Well, I will say War Machine Hordes is nice. They third parties basically came in and said, hey, do you want active play style? Because War Machine Hordes is all about that active play style. It's like, here's some widgets. But if you forget it, that's fine.
Yeah, you can still play with the dice and tape measure. That's the reason why I have a tendency to prefer games like War Machine Hordes, Warhammer, Age of Sigmar.
Dust makes it super easy. Do you even need a tape measure?
Nope.
No.
Yeah,
for the most part.
Literally just die. You
custom...
have some tokens you might need if you want like under fire stuff, but
but even then, you don't really need custom dice as long as you designate what it is.
It is like 6s or like 5s and 6s or faction symbols, blah blah blah.
Yeah, exactly.
So with all that, I'm not a big fan of it. And Fantasy Flight is the one that usually is the company that turned me off because in the starter box, I feel like I'm paying more for custom dice and widgets than I am for the actual game itself. And I don't necessarily like that feeling. I don't like the plop of cardboard down there and things I have to keep track of.
Right.
Now, that's just my personal opinion. I know a lot of people like it because, once again, it plays more similar to a board game, right? Everything you ever need is in that one box ready to go. Just with me, it's a little too much. Warhammer Underworlds is a little bit less, and I prefer it more. But you still have like, that charge, don't charge, and you have the custom dice in it. And I don't think it's necessarily like super gimmicky to have those custom dice, like the custom D6s or the D8s, because you can do all of that with a regular D6 or a regular D8. I just think it's more intuitive to players to look at it and be like, oh, cool. 5s and 6s are hits, 3s and 4s are misses, and 1s and 2s are, whatever.
Yeah, I had that conversation with Sam, who designed all the Star Trek Adventure RPGs.
Yeah.
And so they have these challenge dice, which are D6s, and you have like 3 of the sides have successes, and 2 of them have like this effect thing that happens.
Yeah.
So you can use a D6, but you have to like look at the table in order to see it, or you just roll, because you might roll 6 of them at a time, and you're like, oh crap, is like the 6th the one with the effect? Did I get an effect there? So game design wise for David, because he says he thinks that custom dice are gimmicky. And they can be if you're just looking at a raw success, like in Games Workshop games, 4+ might be a success, right?
Correct,
but if it's a game such as Fantasy Flight, certain Fantasy Flight games where you have an effect in addition to certain successes, that's where the custom dice are more useful.
Yeah, especially with like where you have like criticals or double hits or single hits, you know, like it is... It becomes tedious to have people constantly look at a chart. You remember the old wound chart on Fantasy?
Oh god, yeah.
And having to try to explain that to someone.
So if it's weapon skill was the worst
weapon
one.
skill. Yeah.
If it's double, you're fine. But if it's double plus 1, then you need a 5.
Yeah.
But then if there's a penalty, then it's just
And so moving to custom dice once again usually makes things easier to get into. Does it require you to make sure you have your custom dice with you at all times? Yes, but that's a small trade-off, and my big thing is making sure that the game company gives you access to those dice pretty easily, and they are also not difficult to store.
So one game I think that does a decent job with is Descent. Descent, and it's a Fantasy Flight game, just the same. But Descent was the D&D, the board game, essentially. So you had a party, you go out, but you could get all this equipment. And all this equipment had, like, you roll a brown dice, a red dice, a white dice, a green dice, and the dice just had their own style of pips, either blanks or 1s or 2s. And so you just tried to hit a certain target number, and depending on what dice you roll, it's easier or harder.
Right. That's a classic Fantasy Flight thing, definitely.
Yeah,
exactly.
Like in Legion, they have that where it's like white dice kind of suck, and red dice are awesome.
Yeah, so it is... there's pros and cons of it, right? And it depends on your game design. And how you want to, move about it. Like, if you want to have those, crits or special effects on a dice, doing something like a custom dice is great. But, using something that's like a D6 or a D20, gamers will have those dice on them regardless of playing. So,
are you seeing more games go away from a lot of terrain? Because you talked about before about having grids, but are you seeing some setup time and stuff like that? Are you seeing less of a requirement for setup time?
Yes. So I want to use a Song of Ice and this is a rank and file game. Siggy was asking about that. Who's going to champion it? And I think to champion a rank and file game, you need a strong intellectual property to go with it to entice people into it. And I think A Song of Ice and Fire is one of those ones. You know, it has the Game of Thrones property. But with that, yeah.
No, they can't say.
Oh yeah. And so with that, the box set comes with terrain, and the terrain is, you know, punch out cardboard, which is fine. As any War Machine and Hordes player will tell you, we play with flat terrain all the time.
Mm-hmm.
Now, it doesn't get much more expansive than that. Like the terrain kits, the Kickstarter terrain kits that came with the Song of Ice and Fire is very minimal. And a lot of that has to do with the ease of movement over terrain. And if you look at Legion, Legion's another example. If it wasn't for all those 3D printing companies, the terrain for Legion would be walls and moisture traps and probably whatever...
Like a satellite dish.
Yeah. Whatever 40K stuff kind of fit the feeling and the scale.
Yeah.
And so Legion is another game that I see being relatively terrain light. Once again, to not add the complication of miniature rules for like going over terrain or like climbing up buildings or walls or doing whatever. And then also there's games like Dust in the Box. You get like some barricades, tank traps, and boxes and such. But on the grid system, once again, you get some cardboard cutouts and ready to go. It gets people the feel enough. Shadespire, you literally have no terrain unless you buy the optional terrain. Then you do have some, but once again, it's not very intrusive.
It's on the map.
Yeah, and it creates another storage problem. So, yes, I see a lot of games moving away from having terrain-heavy stuff, but there's also other games that focus on the exact opposite. Like Games Workshop is pumping out terrain kits like nobody's business.
Yeah.
Their terrain... I think they have more terrain than some other companies do have entire lines now.
Right. Yep.
And that's great. 3D terrain, whether you're playing Age of Sigmar, 40K, Infinity is another prime example. It makes the game look gorgeous, and it entices those people that want to get into those like super detailed hobby games. The flat terrain, the easily depicted boards or mats or whatever you're playing on gets newer players who are maybe more reticent about jumping into the hobby, maybe, or board game players, be like, okay, cool, I can paint 5 guys for Underworlds. That's all I have to do. Or I don't even have to paint them. I can paint one at a time, and if I don't like it, fine, whatever.
So to answer the question, if you want to scroll up just a second so we can read that again.
Jared?
But about like the dice rolls, controlling the situation, I think that's really the preference on how fast you want the game to go.
Yeah.
Like, for example, I like Dust, if as a good example for this. Like, infantry always have their infantry save, unless a weapon says not.
Yeah.
You get your infantry save, your cover save. And the way they determine line of sight, especially on the grid system, is that they say, all right, there's a point in the center of each square.
Yeah.
Can you go point to point without crossing like a terrain piece that would block line of sight? If the answer is no, you don't have line of sight. You may be able to see like models on that square, but the issue is like that's just a representation of them being there. They could be hugging the building wall or, for all we know.
Yeah, and so in terms of who got it right for line of sight, I think anything that relies on a standardized metric, like Mark was talking about, like the square or the tile that they're sitting in, or for games that don't have a grid-based system, if it goes off of base size, War Machine and Horde is a good example of this. They have a standardized size for any model on a 50 millimeter base versus a 40 versus a 30, right? And so if your base is covered, it doesn't matter if you modded your guy to have his arm sticking out. That doesn't give you any advantage or penalty. It just lets your model look cool. And I find that those games I like a lot more than something like Warhammer 40K, where they're like, well, is the model more than 25% obscured? I'm like, why does that need to matter?
Yeah.
Because I was using an old style dreadnought, right? And I will tell you guys, the old dreadnoughts are super dinky compared to the new ones.
They are babies.
Yeah. And so I get to move behind terrain better and get a better save just because I happen to have an older model that I liked.
Or the pose wasn't like an arm up or something, you know?
Yeah.
I do have a horror story about this. Two people were playing with the exact same model. One had the newer, one had the older, and they were just on other sides of the same wall.
Yeah.
And the person's like, all right, I'm going to shoot you. And the person said, I get a cover save. It was like, that's fair. Next turn, I'm going to shoot you. It's like, all right, I'm going to get my cover save. It's like, you don't get a cover save. And it's like, so the person picked up his model, replaced it with their model, and it's like, I get a cover save. It's like, oh yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
They're the same model. They just had different time periods in which they were made.
Right.
That shouldn't affect the cover save.
Right.
Yeah, and so basically having something standardized outside of just the model itself is what I think games should do, because it feels more fair, and it also lets you be a little bit more creative with your terrain or your modeling.
There was like rulings where like you can't count wings and banners.
Yeah,
right?
Which is great, right? You know, but when you start having to have those like smaller rules, it expands from that 8 pages of rules to be a little bit more, and then a little bit more.
I have my flying demon friend do a cannonball, so no.
So
Tim took it to the extreme. He says he broke line of sight when he lived in Wisconsin by modding all of his Space Marines to be army crawling.
and you know, that's something that you could do in those games. So once again, having a standardized metric for you know, like for 40K, saying a 32 millimeter base is always like 1.25 inches tall.
Yeah,
no matter what.
Yeah, exactly.
You know?
Infinity does it as well.
Yeah.
But I think the issue is a term that everyone, I guess, I hope most people view with discuss is modding for advantage.
Right. Yeah.
Is a very disgusting term.
Me, as someone who sculpts and mods pretty much everything that I touch, makes me so mad. Because, like, I don't ever want to be penalized or thought that I'm trying to take advantage of rules for just doing something.
Yeah, it's like, why would I, have my character doing this when that just means I get less covers?
Yeah, or in old Age of Sigmar rules, if you have your sword up here and it only has a 1 each, you're not able to go down. All right, guys, I need to start getting the store open. Oh God.
So yeah, I'm gonna reach out to a couple of like folks like Tim. I want to get some opinions from game designers who are active in everything and can get an interview on that because I think it's really cool from the store perspective, seeing as consumers and players and everything. So now I want to get the perspective of the designers themselves. Because that'll be another side to it as well. But overall, things are getting a little simpler. Things are getting faster, more intuitive. I think Jared had something about dice rolling. Like if you have one dice versus a bunch of dice, it's all about how quick you get to rolling the dice, like you were saying, Mark.
Yeah.
Like if you can
I could definitely agree with Tim. True line of sight is a horrible thing because that just spurns arguments. Or why did I stand in front of a building that had a window? What a terrible move. Now they can shoot me.
Yeah, line of sight's always tough on a non-standardized, like a grid system. It's pretty easy. You can always say, like with Dust, you can always say if it's a straight line or whatever, or X amount of spaces. So that's one. It's kind of a dilemma for a lot of games in general.
I think War Machine Hordes did a great job, and I still have some complaints about their terrain rules. But for the most part, it's like 3 inches into terrain is what you can see. If you're looking into a forest, 3 inches.
Right.
That's what you can do. And obviously, if you're on the other side of a forest, regardless of how thick the forest is, you can't see it.
Yep.
So
yeah, I like stuff like that. So in the future, I feel like 2019, 2020, going forward, is going to be easy to set up, super quick to play, fairly easy to break down, but explaining things for new players has to be very intuitive. And then that depth and scalability. If you combine all those things, you have some more wiggle room. From my experience, from our experience, there's a lot of stuff you can mess around with inside that, but that I think will be one of the big things going forward.
Yep.
Cool. All right, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. Thanks, Mark. Thank you, John. He's helping a customer right now.
Bye,
nice.
All right. Have a great weekend, guys.
And then watch out for a fun video coming tomorrow. You're gonna like it. All right. Bye, everybody.
All right.
Yeah.